Hello and welcome to this video about making a good resource for use in the classroom. I first started a website called MFL Sunderland back in 2004 and that became Lightbulb Languages in 2014. Over that time I've made and shared literally thousands of resources, so I thought I'd share with you what I've learned about making an attractive and effective resource. My examples, of course, are going to be from the languages classroom, as I'm a languages teacher, but what I'm going to say can be applied to any subject. I'm going to be talking mainly about worksheet resources, but I'll be referring to PowerPoints as I go along as well. First of all, let's think about the layout of your resource. The first thing you'll need to choose is whether your resource is going to be portrait or landscape. If you're going to choose portrait, you need to put your stimulus or anything you want students to look at and refer to at the top. If it's at the bottom, students are going to be covering up that stimulus when they're writing and they won't be able to see it easily or to use it. If you're using landscape, bear in mind that the majority of students are right-handed, and so it's best to put the stimulus on the left and the space to write in on the right so that they don't cover the stimulus with their arm and hand while they're writing. Once you've decided which orientation your document is going to have, you need to put in your margins. The ones I usually use are 1 centimetre top and bottom and 2 centimetres left and right. You can't have margins that are too small, otherwise some of your content might get chopped off by the printer or by the photocopier. And you also need to bear in mind that you need to leave some space for hole punching if necessary, and it also means that you'll be able to trim the resources so they're just the right size for being stuck on the page of an exercise book. I'm going to show a landscape resource here because it's going to fit better on the screen. I should add at this point that I very nearly always use Microsoft Publisher to make my resources. I much prefer it to Word because everything stays where I put it. If you wanted to, you could use PowerPoint to get a very similar effect. You might want to set up a template for the resources that you make, as you'll find that certain things are going to be on every resource that you make. For me, the name and the date box is always on the top right, and I always put it in the language that I'm teaching. And then I always put my copyright statement at the bottom right. Next, I work out where the title's going to go. It could go at the top, and you can centre it if you want. I do that sometimes. The title should be in bold or in a different font size, or both, to make it stand out from the rest of your text. You could, if you wanted, put the title at the side, like this. You can see here I've used a picture font to make an attractive underlay for the title. You could also use the word art setting for this. And if you want to put some instructions for your activity, they'll need to go at the top of the sheet in a larger or in a bold font as well. You may also want to consider adding your learning objective and a space for you to put your marking and your comment. Mine usually goes in this box at the bottom. Then you need to add your stimulus or your questions or your information on the left for reasons that we've discussed before. Make sure that the information in this section is adequately spaced and in a reasonably sized font. Finally, you'll need to put in the spaces for the students to write their responses. Now, there are several ways to do this. Make sure that whichever way you choose, you provide them with enough space to write in. Younger children in particular have big writing and can get frustrated if they can't fit their answers in. The first example at the top is a table. Now, younger learners sometimes find it hard to write in a table cell which doesn't have an obviously straight line for them to write on. So the second example shows a table with the grid lines removed and a writing line added in each response cell. The table format makes it easier for you to space the answers. The third example is a straightforward number, then a tab, and then the straight line. The lines here are 1.5 points apart, which is the minimum that I would do. Single spacing just isn't enough space for most students writing. Finally, consider adding an example in for the students to use to help them. It clarifies what you're asking them to do and gives you something to use when you're explaining the instructions. You can ask students to tell you how that answer was reached. It's a good idea to use a handwriting font to put the example in, and this is a font that I had of my own handwriting. You can also put images on your resource. Images can help to break up a lot of text and make your resource look a lot friendlier to the student who's using it. Too many images, though, can make it a bit too busy looking and too confusing. If in doubt, less is always more. So the finished resource might look something like this. You'll notice that the majority of it is black and white. Because schools are hard up at the moment, colour printing and copying is expensive, so I stick to black and white unless colour is absolutely necessary. If I put an image on, I'll choose one that will still have the same impact in grayscale as it does in colour. It's completely up to you, of course. You can choose colour for your text, but you need to think about, firstly, how well it's going to print and copy, and secondly, how legible it's going to be for all students. The same rules for colour apply in PowerPoint, of course. So don't use red on green or vice versa, for example, because you'll make life difficult for anyone who has red-green colour blindness. The more contrast, the better. A light pastel background is preferable to pure white, and use a dark coloured text. The main thing that you'll have to decide for your resource is the font. The font is really important. So think about, is the writing big enough or small enough for the students who will be using the resource? Is it clear? Is the font grown up enough? What does the font tell the student about the resource? My favourite fonts that I use have changed over the years. I started off with Comic Sans, and I still use it for PowerPoints because all computers have it, so that means I'll be able to read the PowerPoints wherever I go, and it's also a child-friendly font. I then progressed on to Arial Rounded MT Bold, and from there to just Arial. Nowadays, for younger learners, I usually use the Sassoon family of fonts, sometimes also a cursive font because children use that elsewhere in the curriculum. I'm starting to like the SF Cartoonist hand font more and more as well, but the only problem is it doesn't have a C cedilla for French. The font that I've used for this PowerPoint is called ABZ, and that's my current new favourite. Now, as far as font is concerned, it's important to think about the student who is the destination for your resource. What are they going to find the most accessible? Also consider the size of the font that you use. For age 11 and up, I use 12 point. For younger learners, I usually use 14 point. However, it does depend on the font itself. For PowerPoints, I usually use 40 point or thereabouts to make sure it's legible for everyone in the room. Once you've chosen your font, it's important that you don't use all capital letters. The rounder shapes of lowercase letters make them easier to read, because capital letters are mostly straight lines and look a lot more similar to each other, and this makes it much more difficult, especially for your younger learners, to be able to read fluently what you've written. Some studies suggest that it takes longer to process a text if it's all capitals. If you want to emphasize something on your resource, consider using italics or bold instead of capitals. While I'm on the subject of capital letters, just imagine that you're an 11-year-old who's had a diet in primary school of nice cursive fonts, Sassoon-like fonts, and maybe Comic Sans. Then you go to secondary school and you're faced with all the trendy fonts, like the second two on this screen. Now, if they're used especially in language lessons, students are going to be hit with that double whammy, first of all having to decipher the font, and then having to decipher the foreign language. The bottom font of these three is my own particular least favourite. Aside from being difficult to read, it doesn't model good letter spacing and letter formation. So keep it simple and think of the learners who will be using your resource. So I hope that's given you some ideas on how to make an attractive and effective resource. First of all, you need to decide on the orientation of your page, portrait or landscape, and then your basic layout, including how big your margins are going to be. Choose your font really carefully and decide if you're going to add any images. Try to stick to black and white as much as possible, especially if you're going to be reproducing it. Happy resource making!